Test, test, test. You're listening to the audio lecture for the fourth module of the online Poly 437 International Security course. In this module, which covers a large amount of material, we're going to break it up into three parts. So this first part is going to focus on military strategy, specifically the strategy of the cheap military victory. Then we'll move on to deterrence theory with a particular focus on the Cold War and nuclear deterrence. And then we're going to wrap things up by taking a look at arms control and how states control arms once they believe that their militaries have gotten too big or that their military arsenal or their nuclear arsenals have gotten too dangerous. All these approaches that we're going to be talking about fall under the broad category of strategy. Strategy is the practice of realizing your goals and realizing your goals by identifying the weaknesses of your adversary and exploiting them to your best advantage, of identifying the places where your adversary is most vulnerable, where you are most powerful, and trying to match those up as best you can in a situation of open warfare or in a situation of intense diplomatic negotiation. And the overriding assumption here is that balances of power do not always work, that sometimes they collapse, sometimes they fail. And on the same token, sometimes hegemonies fail. Sometimes powerful states become less powerful for whatever reason because of external or internal pressures. Hegemonies no longer have the ability to lead. So what does a state do in these periods where you don't have these mechanisms that exist to sort of preserve the peace and stability? And what we're going to look at here are, as I've already suggested, three ways of dealing with some contingencies in the situation. The one is the strategy of the cheap military victory. This is sort of a larger approach to conventional warfare. And then we'll move to the realm of nuclear warfare and take a look at deterrence and arms control. And these will be examined within the context of the Cold War. So the first of these approaches is the notion of the cheap victory. And this is when hostilities have taken place or have been declared. What's the best approach to wrapping those hostilities up as quickly as possible? And the approach here is the notion or the idea that war is something that cannot be sustained over the long term. Wars are very costly, both in terms of treasure and in terms of human capital. They can be very unpopular if they last long, and the society has to make undue sacrifices. So the idea here is that if you are going to fight in a war, you fight as quickly and as aggressively as you can in order to cheapen the cost of the conflict, in order to reduce the cost in the long run of the conflict. There are several ways of ensuring that a war is as cheap and as short as possible. One of them is to have an overwhelming military capability before any potential war begins. And this is more or less the American approach to conventional military force today, that the American military is so large and so powerful and so technologically advanced that no other state that is likely to confront the United States on a traditional battlefield has any chance of emerging victorious. And the reason why this is because the United States invests a large amount of money into developing its conventional military capability. In military parlance, this is called full spectrum dominance, where you attempt to dominate every facet of the battlefield, from the troops, the infantry fighting in the trenches, to the armored, mobilized machinery, tanks and trucks and artillery pieces, to the airspace above the battlefield, to the oceans and the seas, to now cyberspace, and having a superior, aggressive, offensive capability that can destroy not just enemy military units, but their computers they use to run their societies, run their states, run their infrastructure. And the sooner you can eliminate this, the more quickly the conflict will end. And in theory, the cheaper the overall cost for both sides. The lower the cost in terms of lives lost, in terms of money spent for both sides. Obviously, one side will be defeated, but that might be for the best in the long run. The problem with this is that this turns out not to be very cheap. That in order to have full spectrum dominance, you have to invest a lot of money in technologies to develop systems that are in fact superior to anything that your adversary might throw up against you. And again, if you look at American military weapons procurement, we have some incredibly expensive weapons platforms that cost in excess of trillions of dollars. We have, I say we, the United States has nuclear submarines that cost $1.5 billion per copy. The stealth bomber costs $2 billion per copy. The F-35 fighter jet, the entire program has cost in excess of $1 trillion. This is very, very expensive. And it may pay off in a future war with an adversary, but in the short term and in the context of a peacetime military disposition, many argue that these costs are too high. Another way of making a war short is to surprise your adversary. And this is also useful for states that may not have superior military technology or numerical advantage. One of the ways to get around any kind of stalemate that might emerge in a potential conflict is to have a plan that will take advantage of an adversary who isn't suspecting attack or isn't suspecting an attack in a place where you plan on attacking them. And you can think of World War I and the Schlieffen Plan, which is demonstrated on the slide here, where the French did not expect the Germans to go through Belgium in any potential invasion. They thought that the Germans might respect Belgium neutrality, and because the area of southern Belgium is somewhat mountainous, you have the Ardennes Mountains there, that they were largely inaccessible, that you couldn't send an army over that rugged terrain any kind of way that it would be effective. And what happened was that the Germans surprised the French, went into Belgium, went through those mountains, managed to sneak a significant amount of material through those mountains, and were able to come out on the other side and surprise the French. Fortunately for the French, they were able to stiffen their lines, reinforce the places where they've been breached, and were able to keep the Germans from making it all the way to Paris, but just barely. And then, of course, as we all know, once those lines were stabilized, trenches were dug, and the rest of the war was prosecuted in largely a fashion of a stalemate. Another choice that states may use in order to shorten a war is to mobilize and deploy their forces as rapidly as possible. Here you're not necessarily taking advantage of a surprise or surprising your enemy. Your enemy knows you're coming, but what you do surprise them with is the speed by which you deploy your forces. And you can see this here in the invasion of Normandy on D-Day, where the Germans knew that there was an invasion coming. But they didn't know exactly where, but they knew the general area, that northern coast of France in the province of Normandy. And one of the ways the Allies were able to successfully land on those beaches was to basically mobilize the bulk of the amphibious forces, send them out into a point in the middle of the English Channel where they could go virtually any direction against the French coast, so that the Germans couldn't react fast enough when that force eventually did go in one particular direction. And so on D-Day, you have the Allied forces sort of muster in the middle of the English Channel at a point called Piccadilly Circus, and then sort of fan out and attack the interior Normandy coast, an area that the Germans couldn't reinforce quickly enough to repulse that particular amphibious landing. Another approach states can use is to isolate an opponent. where your adversary may or may not have a large assemblage of allies, and in going up against this large assemblage of states, you don't have much of a chance of success. But if you can strip some of those allies away and isolate your adversary, then maybe that tips the balance in your favor. And here you can think of the Gulf War, the first Gulf War in 1990 and 1991, where after the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, Saddam Hussein sort of alienated himself, and with the deployment of American forces and other Western military forces in the region, after the passage of a UN resolution condemning the invasion of Kuwait, Iraq found itself more or less isolated. And that when it became time to actually evict Iraqi forces from Kuwait, there weren't a lot of states to come to the assistance of Saddam Hussein. And so you see a successful repulse of that invasion of Kuwait in 1990. For some states that are relatively small, relatively weak, and not in an ideal geographic position, the possibility of shortening a war isn't really possible because they don't really stand a chance in any kind of offensive war. So what they do is to try to make the cost of battle expensive for the adversary that has the advantage over them. And so they establish a strong defense. And this is especially useful if you know that there is an attack coming, if you have some kind of foreknowledge. You can take steps to increase the costs of your adversary who is hoping to make the aggressive action they are about to begin as cheap as possible. A good example of this is Switzerland. Switzerland is a relatively isolated country within Europe. It's surrounded by mountains. Its population is relatively small. And historically, they've been surrounded by states that have acted very aggressively. France, the former German states that eventually consolidated into Germany, the states that consolidated into Italy. If you look at the history of Europe, Switzerland's been surrounded by some very aggressive principalities and states. And so they've dealt with this by basically saying, we can't attack you, we're not going to act aggressively, we don't have the capacity, but if any of you try to invade us, it's going to cost you dearly. And we're going to do this by, for example, ensuring that all of our citizens have rifles. All of our citizens are trained in the use of basic firearms. That's sort of what the photo here is referring to, two young ladies riding their bikes as they carry their rifles to the shooting range to practice. And this is true in Switzerland, that if you go to any household, that your chances are that the people who live there have had some kind of training on firearms. And the idea is that if there's ever an invasion from the outside, that that army is going to have to fight every single citizen who's armed and ready to defend their country, ready to defend their homes against any potential invasion. And that will increase the cost of any potential victory. That victory will not be cheap for the aggressor. It will be expensive. And if it's too expensive, then maybe that dissuades them from attacking in the first place. Probably the greatest theorist of the cheap victory strategy was the Chinese thinker Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War in the 4th century, what we call BC or BCE now. His book, it's kind of a cross between a poem and a how-to book, is full of all sorts of interesting advice and wisdom on how to minimize the costs of war for any army engaged in any kind of open military conflict. Now, The Art of War is a fascinating book, and I would encourage anyone to pick it up and read it if you're interested in some of these themes. We don't have time to go into all the details of Sun Tzu's work, but I'll point out a couple key points. First off, Sun Tzu argues that the most important thing to destroy in any open conflict with an enemy is the enemy's will to fight. That if you smash their morale, you smash their desire to actually participate in the conflict first, then you've essentially won the battle. And if you destroy their will to fight before the actual fighting begins, you can essentially eliminate and win the battle, eliminate the enemy, win the battle before a single shot is fired. How do you do that? You need yes, brute strength, you need powerful military capability, but you also need to be able to utilize deception, ruse, maneuver, and the use of the indirect approach. You have to be creative. You have to make yourself appear stronger than you actually are. You have to make yourself seem to appear in places that you aren't, and appear like you're not in places that you actually are in strength. It's again, it's very vague. It's very Zen, of course, but it also speaks to some truths about what it takes to be successful on the battlefield. It's not just about deploying as much force as you can and deploying as much firepower as you can at a particular point. It's about fooling your enemy and making your enemy do things that it shouldn't do or doesn't want to do, and have them play into your hands. And if you can do this well, if you can sort of manipulate your enemy this way, you can win without having to fight. So what are some examples of Sun Tzu's idea put into practice? We could think of the Second Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq by the United States in 2003. And in the lead up to the actual physical invasion of the country, you had a campaign that was called Shock and Awe. And the idea was that if you dropped enough bombs onto the cities of Iraq, specifically Baghdad, and attacked, presidential palaces and government offices and symbols of Saddam's power, you would so demoralize the troops and the people of Iraq that they would not have the will to fight and resist the eventual American invasion. That when they realized that the United States was coming, that the army was on its way, and they were seeing and experiencing this aerial bombardment, they would more or less give up. And thus the war would be substantially less damaging than it might otherwise be. And notice that in some ways this was successful. If you measure success in terms of the ability of the United States to invade the country, arrive in Baghdad, and take control of the apparatus of government, that was done relatively easily. The problem, of course, came in the days, months, and years later, where the stability of the state was never fully achieved. Indeed, Iraq is also an example of how one thwarts a cheap victory strategy. Whereas the United States did arrive in the capital and topple Saddam Hussein relatively quickly, those who eventually came to resist the American invasion were able to thwart the cheap victory because they engaged in a series of practices that raised the costs of the American occupation there. And these strategies include things like not directly confronting an enemy that's superior to you, because you'll be completely obliterated on a traditional battlefield if you don't have the equipment and technology and know-how to face a superior enemy on a traditional battlefield. You want to engage in irregular warfare and unconventional warfare to prolong the conflict for as long as you can. The longer the conflict goes on, the higher the cost, the more the people both fighting the war and the civil society back home that are sponsoring the war will grow tired of the conflict. You have to win the hearts and minds of the people who are subject to the invasion or subject to the intervention, to sort of castigate the invaders, make them seem like they're the bad people, even if they might not be or have, honest intentions. And when you see weakness in the invader, you launch a counteroffensive. When you believe that you no longer have to hide in the shadows and you can actually meet the enemy in an open battlefield because it is sufficiently weakened that you can take it on in a traditional sort of way. If you think about Vietnam, the Tet Offensive was an attempt by the Viet Cong to essentially launch this counter-offensive and increase the cost of that conflict. And while the Tet Offensive was a failure from a tactical point of view, in that the Viet Cong did not win any battles during the Tet Offensive, they were successful on the strategic point of view because it showed how costly this war was going to be. That despite the fact that American leaders, political and military leaders, were saying that this conflict is not going to go on much longer, it's almost over, just be patient a little bit longer, The Tet Offensive demonstrated that that was not the case, that the enemy was still very strong. It was able to launch this huge counteroffensive. It was able to get onto the grounds of the U.S. Embassy, and that all this talk about a short conflict was just a bunch of hogwash. And so the cheap victory was thwarted by this Tet Offensive. Indeed, this raises the question if cheap victory is really possible in the end. We talked about the Schlieffen Plan of World War I as being an example of the Germans trying to realize a cheap victory strategy. And while it very nearly was successful, eventually the French were able to stop the German invasion. And when they did so, you had trench warfare set in, and then you had the stalemate that went on for 4 years that resulted in the death of tens of millions of soldiers and countless more millions of civilians during that conflict. So in this case, the victory for the Germans not only wasn't cheap, it was non-existent because they were largely blamed for the war and had to pay the costs after the war for being labeled the aggressor in that conflict. In World War II, we see the Germans again try to cheapen the cost of what they saw as their eventual victory by merely bombing London and Great Britain rather than doing the actual invasion. If you recall from your history that Germany had been running roughshod over Europe after 1939, the invasion of Poland. They had taken possession of a lot of territory around Europe, and it was going to be very difficult and expensive for them to mount an amphibious assault to take control of the British Isles. And so Hitler believed that if we simply bombed them, we have the Luftwaffe bomb London and bomb the other major British cities, they would lose their taste, lose their will to fight, and that would knock them out of the war. If we didn't actually control that territory, it would at the very least knock Great Britain out of the war, and that would cheapen the eventual victory for Nazi Germany in Europe. It didn't work out that way, of course, because Britain refused to capitulate, and eventually Britain was able to pull in the United States, regain its strength with the help of its US allies, and eventually defeat Germany at the end of World War II. And as I've already mentioned, the United States, with its invasion of Iraq, also sought to achieve victory as cheaply as possible. And again, if we're measuring victory in terms of toppling the regime, the victory was relatively cheap, only about $1.5 trillion. The problem was that the goal for that invasion was not simply toppling the regime. Part of the deal was that the United States would help rebuild the country, and there things didn't turn out quite as wasn't as cheap as we had thought and we had hoped. And the cost now is estimated to be as much as $6 trillion in terms of having to pay all the costs associated with the invasion. A lot as medical costs with treating veterans who have obviously been badly injured in that conflict and have come back to the United States and require sustained treatment as a result of injuries sustained. So in this case, what appeared to be a cheap victory turned out to be very, very costly. And again, it raises the question, is there really such thing as a cheap victory?